A billionaire was taking his fiancée home until he saw his maid. The crosswalk with his triplets, the shattered glass. The rain inside the city of Seattle didn't wash away the grime. It just made the neon lights of the skyscrapers bleed onto the asphalt. Inside the cabin of the obsidian black Maybach, however, the world was silent, temperature-controlled, and scented with expensive leather and Tiffany St. Clair's overpowering jasmine perfume. Alexander Thorne sat in the driver's seat, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. He rarely drove himself. He had a fleet of chauffeurs for that. But tonight, he needed the illusion of control. The illusion was failing. Beside him, Tiffany was scrolling through her tablet, her manicured nail tapping rhythmically against the glass screen. The sound was driving a spike of irritation right through Alexander's temple. "The florist says the white hydrangeas are out of season, Alex," Tiffany sighed, not looking up. "Can you believe that? I told him to fly them in from Holland. I won't have common roses at the wedding. It makes us look accessible." Alexander didn't answer. He stared out at the blurred city streets. His mind wasn't on hydrangeas. It was on the silence of his own home. Since his wife, Eleanor, had passed away during childbirth 3 months ago, his mansion had become a mausoleum. He had thrown himself into his empire, quadrupling his wealth in a quarter, burying his grief under mountains of paperwork. He had left his newborn triplets, Noah, Liam, and Ava, in the care of the night staff and the day nurses. He wrote the checks. He provided the roof. That was all he had the strength to do. "Are you even listening to me?" Tiffany snapped, turning her sharp, beautiful face toward him. "I said, we need to decide on the appetizers. The caterer suggests caviar on blinis, but I think that's so 2010. "Do whatever you want, Tiffany," Alexander murmured, his voice a low rumble. "It's just a party." "It is not just a party. It is the social event of the decade. It is my coronation as Mrs. Thorne," she hissed. "And speaking of baggage, did you confirm the reservation for the triplets at the Golden Cradle Center for the weekend? I don't want crying babies ruining the rehearsal dinner." "They are at the nursery," Alexander said, slowing down as the traffic light ahead turned a menacing red. "Mrs. Higgins manages their schedule. I assume they are sleeping." The car came to a smooth halt at the crosswalk. The intersection was busy, filled with commuters rushing home to escape the drizzle. Alexander looked through the rain-streaked windshield, his blue eyes scanning the crowd without really seeing them. Just faceless shapes in gray coats. Then, his heart stopped. It was a physical sensation, a sudden seizing of his chest that made him gasp. There, right in the middle of the crosswalk, walking against the flashing hand signal, was a woman. She wasn't wearing a designer trench coat. She was wearing a modest grey maid's uniform, the hem wet from the puddles, with a stark white apron that seemed to glow under the streetlights. It was Sarah. The quiet girl Mrs. Higgins had hired a month ago to help with the laundry. But Sarah wasn't doing laundry. She was walking with a purposeful, terrifying slowness, her head held high, ignoring the honking taxis. Strapped to her chest was a large beige baby carrier, and peeking out of the top of the carrier were 3 tiny heads wearing matching knitted beanies. One blue, one green, one pink. Alexander blinked, sure he was hallucinating from lack of sleep. He squinted. The woman turned her head slightly to check the traffic, and he saw the profile of the baby in the center. Noah. He recognized the birthmark on the infant's cheek, a small shape resembling a star, the same one Eleanor had kissed before she died. "What is she doing?" Alexander whispered, the air leaving his lungs. Tiffany looked up, following his gaze. Her eyes went wide, and then her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. Is that the help?" Tiffany shrieked. She slammed her hand against the dashboard. "That is the cleaning girl, and she has... oh my God, she has the triplets. Why are they outside?" Alexander's voice cracked. "It's raining. She's stealing them," Tiffany screamed, pointing a finger that looked like a weapon through the windshield. "Look at her. She's kidnapping your children right in front of us. I knew she was trash. I knew it." The light turned green, but Alexander didn't move the car. He threw the transmission into park and threw his door open. The sound of the city rushed in, sirens, rain, angry horns, breaking the sterile silence of his life. "Alex, don't you dare get out!" Tiffany yelled, scrambling to unbuckle her seatbelt. Alexander ignored her. He ran into the street, his Italian leather shoes splashing into the gutter. He ignored the cars swerving around him. He ran toward the sidewalk where Sarah had just stepped up, safely out of the road. "Sarah!" he roared. The woman froze. She turned slowly. Her face was calm, shockingly calm compared to the chaos surrounding her. She looked tired, dark circles under her eyes, but her posture was upright, dignified. As Alexander stormed closer, breathless and terrified, he expected her to run. He expected guilt. Instead, she placed a protective hand over the heads of the babies. "Mr. Thorne," she said softly. Her voice was a melodic contrast to the blaring horns. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Alexander demanded, reaching out but stopping inches from the carrier. He was afraid to touch them. He realized with a sickening jolt that he didn't know how to hold them all at once. "Where are you taking my children?" Tiffany arrived breathless behind him, her heels clicking aggressively on the pavement. "You thief! You dirty little thief!" she screamed, lunging at Sarah. "I'm calling the police! Give me those babies!" At the sound of Tiffany's screeching voice, the middle baby, Noah, began to wail. Immediately, Liam and Ava joined in. The sound was heartbreaking, a chorus of distress that cut through Alexander's anger. "You're scaring them," Sarah said, her voice firm. She didn't step back. She stepped between Tiffany and the babies, shielding them with her own body. She looked at Alexander, her dark eyes filled not with fear, but with a profound disappointment. "They were screaming for hours, sir. They were hungry, and the formula delivery never came. The pantry was empty." "Empty?" Alexander stammered. "I transfer $10,000 a month for household expenses. Mrs. St. Clair fired the delivery service yesterday," Sarah said quietly, looking at Tiffany. "She said it was too expensive. I tried to call you, sir." "But your secretary said you were in a meeting." Alexander turned to Tiffany. She went pale, her mouth opening and closing like a fish. I was streamlining the budget, Alex. They charge too much for organic milk," Tiffany stammered. "So you took them?" "Where?" Alexander looked back at Sarah. "To the pharmacy on 5th, Sarah replied, gently bouncing on her heels, a rhythmic motion that instantly began to soothe the crying infants. "I bought the formula with my own money. We were just walking home." Alexander looked down. In her hand, Sarah clutched a plastic bag from a drugstore. Inside were 3 cans of premium formula. He looked at his fiancée, dressed in silk, who was worried about the cost of milk. Then he looked at his maid, dressed in a gray uniform, who had carried 3 infants 6 blocks in the rain because they were hungry. The shame that washed over him was colder than the rain. "Get in the car," Alexander commanded, his voice shaking. "I will not ride with a kidnapper," Tiffany protested. "Not you," Alexander said, his eyes fixed on Sarah. He opened the back door of the Maybach. "Sarah, get in the car, please." The ghost in the nursery. The drive back to the Thorne estate was excruciating. The silence was heavy, broken only by the soft, wet sounds of the triplets sucking on their pacifiers. Pacifiers Sarah had pulled from her apron pocket like magic tricks. Alexander watched them in the rearview mirror. Sarah sat in the middle of the spacious leather back seat, the carrier unbuckled now. The 3 babies arranged on her lap and chest like a puzzle of limbs and blankets. She didn't look at the luxury around her. Her eyes were closed, her lips moving in a silent song, her hand rhythmically patting Liam's back. In the passenger seat, Tiffany fumed, typing furiously on her phone, likely spinning the narrative to her friends before the tabloids could get hold of the kidnapping story. When they pulled into the driveway of the massive stone mansion, the rain had stopped. Alexander parked and immediately got out to open the back door. He hesitated, his hands hovering. "I can take one," he offered awkwardly. Sarah looked up, her eyes kind but guarded. "Support his head, sir. Noah is the heavy sleeper, but his neck is still fragile. Alexander took his son. The weight of the child was terrifying. Noah shifted, let out a small sigh, and settled against Alexander's stiff suit jacket. A strange warmth spread through Alexander's chest, thawing a piece of the ice that had been there since Eleanor died. Inside the mansion, the atmosphere shifted. Tiffany immediately regained her composure, snapping her fingers at the butler. "James, call security. I want her bags searched before she leaves. I don't believe this pharmacy story for a second. She was probably taking them to a pawn shop." "No one is leaving," Alexander said, his voice echoing in the marble foyer. He handed Noah back to Sarah, realizing he didn't know where the bottles were kept. "Sarah, take them to the nursery. Feed them. We will discuss this later." "Alex, you cannot be serious." Tiffany grabbed his arm. "She humiliated us. She took them off the property without permission." "They were starving, Tiffany." Alexander pulled his arm away. "Because of your budget cuts." He walked away, leaving Tiffany seething in the hallway. He needed a drink. But more than that, he needed to understand what was happening in his own house. For the next hour, Alexander sat in his study, staring at a glass of scotch he didn't drink. He felt like a stranger in his own life. He realized he didn't know the names of the night nurses. He didn't know what his children ate. He had outsourced his fatherhood to write checks. He stood up and walked toward the east wing, where the nursery was located. He moved quietly, the thick carpets muffling his footsteps. He wanted to catch Sarah in a lie. Part of him wanted Tiffany to be right, because if Tiffany was right, then he wasn't a negligent father. He was just a victim of a bad employee. But as he approached the nursery door, which was slightly ajar, he heard it. Singing. It wasn't a nursery rhyme. It was a soulful, humming melody, deep and resonant. It sounded like a gospel hymn, or perhaps a lullaby from a faraway place. Alexander stopped in the shadows of the hallway and peered through the crack in the door. The nursery was dimly lit by a warm, golden lamp. The sterile, white, hospital-like atmosphere he remembered was gone. Sarah had draped a colorful shawl over the harsh overhead lights to soften the glare. She was sitting in the rocking chair, holding Ava. Liam and Noah were already asleep in their cribs. Sarah was feeding Ava a bottle, her eyes locked on the baby's face with an intensity of adoration that Alexander had only seen once before, in Eleanor's eyes. "There you go, little princess," Sarah whispered, wiping a drop of milk from Ava's chin with her thumb. "You eat up. You need to be strong." She rocked gently. "You have your daddy's eyes, you know that. Blue like the ocean. He's a good man, your daddy. He's just lost. He's swimming in deep water without a map. But he loves you. We have to be patient with him." Alexander felt the breath leave his body. She wasn't cursing him. She wasn't complaining about her low wages or the heavy workload. She was painting a picture of him as a hero to his daughter. A hero he didn't deserve to be. Just then, Tiffany stormed down the hallway, her heels clicking loudly. Alexander quickly pressed himself into an alcove, hiding. Tiffany pushed the nursery door open, shattering the peace. Sarah flinched, pulling Ava closer to her chest. "I hope you're happy," Tiffany sneered, leaning against the doorframe. "You made me look like a fool in front of him." "I was just feeding the child, ma'am," Sarah said, keeping her voice low to not wake the boys. "Don't get comfortable," Tiffany hissed. "I'm going to replace you with a certified European governess by Monday. Someone who knows their place. Someone who doesn't smell like poverty." Tiffany walked over to the crib where Liam lay. She wrinkled her nose. "Ugh. This room smells like spit up. How can you stand it? It's disgusting." "It smells like life, ma'am," Sarah replied evenly. "It smells like a mess," Tiffany countered. She reached out to touch the expensive mobile hanging over the crib, her diamond bracelet catching the light. "Enjoy the mansion while you can, Sarah. Alexander listens to me. You're just the help. You're invisible." Tiffany spun around and marched out. Alexander waited until she was gone. He stepped out of the shadows and looked into the room again. Sarah was still rocking, unbothered, undisturbed. She looked down at Ava. "Don't listen to her," Sarah whispered to the baby. "You are not a mess. You are a miracle." Alexander leaned his head against the wall, closing his eyes. He felt a tear track down his cheek, hot and shameful. He had spent months mourning the loss of his wife, thinking love had died with her. But here, in this room, amidst the smell of milk and soap, love was alive. It was being kept alive by a woman he barely knew. He didn't enter the room. He didn't interrupt. He turned and walked back to his empty, cold bedroom, realizing for the first time that the richest person in this house wasn't him. It was the maid. And he knew, with a terrifying certainty, that Tiffany was right about one thing. Sarah had to go. Not because she was a thief, but because every time Alexander looked at her, he saw the father he failed to be. But he also knew he couldn't let her go. Not yet. The children needed her, and he was starting to realize maybe he needed her too. The serpent in the cradle. The fragile peace in the Thorne mansion lasted exactly 2 weeks. In that time, the atmosphere had shifted subtly, like the changing of seasons. Alexander had begun coming home earlier. He told himself it was to review the quarterly projections in his home office, but in reality, he found himself drawn to the East Wing. He would stand by the door, listening to Sarah read stories to the triplets, her voice rising and falling with the characters. Occasionally he would step in, awkward and stiff, and Sarah would simply smile, hand him a bottle, and guide his hands on how to hold Liam or Noah without looking like he was holding a bomb. Tiffany St. Clair noticed everything. She saw the way Alexander's shoulders relaxed when the maid entered the room. She saw the way the triplets tracked Sarah with their eyes, ignoring everyone else. But most dangerously, she saw that Sarah was becoming indispensable. And in Tiffany's world, no one was indispensable except herself. On a Tuesday evening, the trap was sprung. It began with a shriek from the master bedroom. Alexander, who had just loosened his tie in the hallway, froze. "Alex! Alexander! Call the police!" Tiffany's voice was hysterical. Alexander rushed into the bedroom to find Tiffany tearing apart her vanity. Drawers were pulled out, jewelry boxes upended on the floor, silk scarves scattered like debris. "What is it? What happened?" Alexander asked, alarmed. "My bracelet," Tiffany gasped, tears streaming down her perfectly contoured face. "The vintage Cartier diamond cuff. The one your mother gave you to give to me. It's gone." Alexander frowned. "Are you sure? You probably left it at the club." "I took it off an hour ago, right here." She pointed to the vanity. "I went to take a shower, and when I came back, it was gone. And I know who was in here." She stopped, her eyes narrowing with calculated malice. "The maid, Sarah. She was bringing in the fresh towels." "Sarah wouldn't steal, Tiffany," Alexander said, though a seed of doubt was instantly planted. He remembered Sarah's worn-out shoes. He remembered the poverty of her neighborhood. Desperate people did desperate things. "Oh, Alex, you are so naive," Tiffany scoffed, wiping her eyes. "She plays the saint, but have you seen how she looks at things in this house? Like she's starving for them. We need to check her bag, now, before she leaves for the night." They found Sarah in the nursery. She was packing her worn canvas tote bag, getting ready to catch the last bus. The triplets were asleep, finally peaceful after a colicky afternoon. "Sarah," Alexander said, his voice hard, reverting to the cold CEO tone he used in boardrooms. "Empty your bag onto the table." Sarah looked up, confused. She saw the security guard standing behind Alexander and the triumphant smirk on Tiffany's face. "Sir? Is something wrong?" "Do as he says," Tiffany snapped. "Don't pretend you don't know, you little thief." With trembling hands, Sarah upended her bag. Out tumbled a spare uniform, a Bible, a Tupperware container with leftover rice, and a few bus tokens. "There's nothing here," Alexander said, letting out a breath he didn't know he was holding. "Tiffany, you're mistaken." "Check the side pocket," Tiffany insisted, stepping forward. "The one with the zipper." Sarah froze. I didn't put anything in there." The security guard stepped forward, took the bag, and unzipped the side pocket. He reached in and pulled out a small bundle wrapped in a burp cloth. He unfolded it. The diamonds glittered cruelly under the nursery lights. Alexander felt like he had been punched in the gut. The evidence was undeniable. "I didn't take that," Sarah whispered, shaking her head, her eyes wide with shock. "I swear on my life, Mr. Thorne, I have never stolen a penny. Someone must have put it there." "Who?" Tiffany laughed, a harsh, brittle sound. "The babies. Don't insult our intelligence." "You saw an opportunity to get rich quick." Alexander looked at Sarah. He wanted to believe her. He looked at her honest face, the face that had sung his children to sleep. But the diamonds were there. Tiffany walked over to Alexander and placed a hand on his chest, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "Alex, there's something else. I didn't want to tell you because I knew you'd be upset, but I've seen things. When she thinks no one is watching." "What things?" Alexander asked hoarsely. "I've seen her pinch them," Tiffany lied, her voice dripping with fake sorrow. "To make them cry, just so she could pick them up and play the savior. That's why they cry so much, Alex. She's hurting them." That broke him. The theft was one thing, hurting his children was unforgivable. The memory of Noah wailing in pain flashed through his mind. A red haze of protective rage blinded him. "Get out," Alexander said, his voice deadly quiet. "Mr. Thorne, please, listen to me." Sarah stepped forward, tears filling her eyes. "Get out!" Alexander roared, the sound waking the triplets. "You are fired. If I ever see you near my property again, I will have you arrested. Be grateful I'm not calling the police tonight for the sake of my children's reputation." "Sir, she is lying. She put it there," Sarah pleaded, looking at Tiffany. "How can you do this? They need me. Noah needs his medicine at 8 p.m. Ava needs to be held upright after feeding or she chokes." "Security, remove her." Alexander turned his back. Two guards grabbed Sarah by the arms. She didn't fight them, but she turned her head back toward the cribs where the triplets were now screaming, a terrified, heart-wrenching sound that echoed off the walls. "Take care of them," Sarah sobbed as she was dragged into the hallway. "Please, just take care of them." The front door slammed shut. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the hysterical crying of 3 motherless children. Tiffany walked over to the cribs, picked up the diamond bracelet from the table, and slipped it onto her wrist. "Finally," she muttered, looking at the screaming babies with disdain. "Now we can get some professionals in here." Alexander stood by the window, watching Sarah's small figure walking down the long driveway in the rain. He felt a sickness in his stomach that no amount of scotch could wash away. He told himself he had protected his family, but as the screams from the nursery intensified, it didn't feel like protection. It felt like a mistake. The silence of the grave 5 days. It had been 5 days since Sarah left, and the Thorne mansion had descended into a level of hell Alexander didn't know existed. The professionals Tiffany had hired, stern women in crisp white uniforms from a high-end agency, lasted less than 48 hours. The triplets were inconsolable. They rejected the bottle. They rejected being held. They screamed until their voices were raspy croaks. And then they screamed some more. Alexander hadn't slept. He had dark circles under his eyes that rivaled Sarah's. He stopped going to the office. He spent his days and nights pacing the nursery floor, holding Noah or Liam, trying to mimic the hum he had heard Sarah use. It didn't work. To them, he was just a stiff, frightened man who smelled of stress, not the warm, rhythmic safety of Sarah. Tiffany, meanwhile, had checked herself into a spa for the weekend, claiming the negative energy in the house was bad for her complexion. "Call me when you fix them, Alex," she had said as she breezed out the door. On the 5th night, the crisis reached its breaking point. It was 3 a.m. The nursery was a war zone of discarded diapers and untouched formula bottles. Alexander was sitting on the floor, exhausted, with Ava in his arms. She had been the quietest of the 3, which Alexander initially thought was a blessing. But now he realized it was a warning. She was lethargic. Her skin felt hot and dry like parchment paper. She wasn't crying anymore. She was letting out small, weak whimpers. "Ava," Alexander tapped her cheek. "Wake up, sweetie. Drink something." She didn't respond. Her eyes rolled back slightly and her breathing was shallow, rapid and terrifyingly irregular. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced Alexander's exhaustion. "Mrs. Higgins!" he shouted, scrambling to his feet. "Call 911! Now!" The next hour was a blur of paramedics, flashing lights, and the terrifying speed of the ambulance. At the private hospital, the doctors stabilized her, hooking her tiny body up to IV fluids. "She's severely dehydrated and suffering from exhaustion," Dr. Roberts said, looking at Alexander with judgment. "It's a failure to thrive. She's refusing to eat. It's almost as if she's grieving, Mr. Thorne. Has there been a sudden separation from a primary caregiver?" The question hit Alexander like a physical blow. "Yes," he whispered. "Her nanny left 5 days ago." "Well, you need to get her back," Dr. Roberts said sternly. "Baby's this young imprint. To her, that woman was her mother. You've severed the bond, and she's giving up." Alexander nodded, numb. He walked out of the room to let the nurses work. He needed to find Ava's vaccination records for the hospital file. He remembered seeing a folder in the nursery, tucked into the side of the changing table. He drove back to the empty mansion like a madman. He ran up the stairs to the nursery. He tore through the drawers of the changing table. Underneath a stack of diapers, his hand brushed against a piece of lined notebook paper. It wasn't a medical record. It was a letter. The handwriting was neat, looped, and careful. "To Mr. Thorne, if you are reading this, I am probably gone. I know Mrs. St. Clair doesn't like me, and I fear my time here is short. But I need you to know things about your children that aren't in books. Noah gets gas pains after 6 p.m. Rub his back clockwise. It helps. Liam is afraid of the dark. Leave the hall light on. And little Ava. She needs to hear a heartbeat to sleep. She misses her mother. I hold her on my left side so she can hear my heart, and she pretends it's her mommy. Please, sir, don't let them grow up in a cold house. They are full of light. You just have to be brave enough to look at it." Respectfully, Sarah Alexander crumpled the letter to his chest, a sob escaping his throat. She hadn't written a defense of her character. She hadn't asked for money. She had written an instruction manual on how to love his children because she knew she was being forced out. She pinched them. Tiffany's voice echoed in his head. I saw it. A sudden chilling thought seized him. The nursery had cameras. High-definition, motion-activated cameras that backed up to a private cloud server. Alexander had installed them himself, but had never checked them, trusting Tiffany's word. He pulled out his phone, his fingers shaking so hard he mistyped the password twice. Finally, he logged into the security app. He scrolled back to Tuesday. The timestamp, 5:45 p.m. The incident. On the screen, the nursery was empty. Then Tiffany entered. She was wearing a silk robe. She looked around, checking the hallway. Then she reached into her pocket. Alexander watched, his breath stopping, as Tiffany St. Clair pulled out the diamond bracelet. She walked over to Sarah's canvas bag on the chair. She unzipped the side pocket, wrapped the bracelet in a cloth, and stuffed it deep inside. Then she walked over to Noah's crib. Alexander watched in horror as his fiancée, the woman he planned to marry, leaned over the crib. Noah was sleeping. Tiffany reached out and sharply pinched the infant's arm. Noah jerked awake and started screaming. Tiffany smiled, a cold, satisfied smirk, and walked out of the room just as Sarah came rushing in from the bathroom, looking panicked, immediately scooping up the crying baby to comfort him. Alexander stared at the screen. The image of Tiffany pinching his son burned into his retinas. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a clash of personalities. It was evil. Pure, calculated evil living in his house, sleeping in his bed, and he had let it happen. He had exiled the only person who had stood between his children and this monster. He threw the phone across the room. It shattered against the wall, but the image remained. He didn't scream. He didn't break anything else. A deadly calm settled over him. It was the calm of a man who finally knew his mission. He walked out of the nursery. He didn't call the chauffeur. He got into his car, the engine roaring to life. He wasn't going to the hospital. Not yet. He had to go to the terrifyingly poor neighborhood on the south side of the city. He had to find a gray house with a peeling fence. He had to beg. Alexander Thorne drove into the night, no longer a billionaire, but a desperate father trying to save the life of his daughter. The kneeling king and the queen of hearts. The GPS on the dashboard of the Maybach glowed with a destination that no luxury car had likely ever visited. District 9, the Flats. It was a neighborhood where the city's neglect was visible in the cracked sidewalks, the boarded-up windows, and the flickering orange streetlights that buzzed like dying insects. Alexander Thorne didn't care about the safety of his vehicle. He didn't care about the mud splashing onto the pristine paintwork. He cared only about the crushing weight in his chest, a physical manifestation of the time running out for his daughter. He pulled up to the address, a small, weather-beaten house with a peeling white fence and a porch that leaned precariously to the left. It was humble, bordering on poor, yet there were flower boxes in the windows, defying the gloom with bright, resilient marigolds. Alexander turned off the ignition. The silence of the car was suffocating. He stepped out into the night air, which smelled of rain and exhaust. He walked up the narrow concrete path, his heart hammering against his ribs harder than it ever had during any billion-dollar merger. He knocked. For a long moment there was no answer. Then, the sound of a deadbolt sliding back, a chain rattling, and the door creaked open. It wasn't Sarah. It was an older woman, her face etched with deep lines of hardship and wisdom. She wore a floral housecoat and leaned on a cane. She looked at Alexander's bespoke suit, his frantic eyes, and his desperate posture. She didn't look impressed. She looked tired. "We don't want any," the woman said, her voice dry. "Whatever you're selling, we don't have the money." "I'm not selling anything," Alexander said, his voice cracking. "I'm looking for Sarah. Please, it's a matter of life and death." The old woman narrowed her eyes. "You're him, aren't you? The rich man. The one who fired my girl for stealing." "I was wrong," Alexander said quickly, stepping closer to the screen door. "I made a terrible mistake. Please, I need to speak to her." "She's crying in the back room," the woman said, not moving an inch. "She's been crying for 5 days. You broke her heart, Mr. Thorne. Not because of the job. She can scrub floors anywhere. You broke it because you took her away from those babies." "I know," Alexander whispered. He fell to his knees. He didn't plan it. His legs just gave out under the weight of his shame. There, on the splintered wood of the porch, the billionaire knelt before the grandmother of his former maid. "My daughter is dying," Alexander choked out, tears finally spilling over, hot and unstopped. "Ava. She won't eat. She's fading away. The doctors say she's grieving. She needs her mother. And I realized tonight that her mother isn't the woman buried in the cemetery. And it certainly isn't me. It's Sarah." The old woman stared at him, her expression softening just a fraction. She saw the raw terror in his eyes. "Sarah!" the woman called out over her shoulder, her voice sharp but not unkind. "Get your coat." Sarah appeared in the hallway a moment later. She looked smaller than Alexander remembered. Her eyes were puffy and red, her hair tied back in a messy bun. She wore oversized sweatpants and a faded t-shirt. When she saw Alexander kneeling on her porch, she gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. "Mr. Thorne?" "Sarah." Alexander scrambled to his feet, fumbling in his pocket. He didn't pull out money. He pulled out the crumpled letter she had hidden in the nursery. "I found it. I read it. And I saw the video." Sarah's eyes widened. "I saw her put the bracelet in your bag," Alexander rushed on, the words tumbling out. "I saw her pinch Noah. I saw everything. I am so sorry. I am a fool. A blind, arrogant fool. But Ava is in the hospital." The color drained from Sarah's face. "Which hospital?" "St. Jude's. She's on an IV. She's giving up, Sarah. She needs you." Sarah didn't ask for an apology. She didn't ask for her job back. She didn't ask for a raise. She simply moved. She grabbed her coat from the hook and stepped out onto the porch, her face set with a fierce maternal determination. "Drive," she commanded. The drive to the hospital was a blur of speed and silence. Alexander drove like a man possessed, weaving through traffic. Sarah sat in the passenger seat, her hands clasped in prayer, her eyes closed. "I tried to tell you," she whispered once, her voice trembling. "I tried to tell you she was wicked." "I know." Alexander gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. "I was listening to the wrong things. I was looking at pedigrees and bank accounts when I should have been looking at who was holding my children." They arrived at the emergency entrance. Alexander didn't wait for valet. He left the Maybach running at the curb and ran inside with Sarah. When they reached the pediatric ICU, the scene was terrifying. Nurses were gathered around a small glass incubator. Monitors were beeping a frantic, high-pitched rhythm. Dr. Roberts looked up, his face grim. "Her heart rate is erratic," Dr. Roberts said, shouting over the noise. "She's going into distress. We might have to sedate her to calm the system down." "No," Sarah said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the panic like a blade. "Let me through." The nurses parted. They saw the uniform, or lack thereof, but they also saw the way this woman moved. She moved like she owned the room. Sarah approached the bed. Ava looked tiny against the white sheets, her skin pale, her little chest heaving with shallow, ineffective breaths. Her eyes were squeezed shut, her face contorted in a silent cry of abandonment. Sarah lowered the side rail. She didn't hesitate. She leaned down, scooping the fragile bundle into her arms, ignoring the wires and tubes. She pulled Ava against her chest, right against her heart, just as the letter had said. "Shh, shh, shh," Sarah hummed, the sound vibrating deep in her chest. "I'm here. Mama Sarah is here. I'm here, little bird. I'm not going anywhere." She began to rock. It was the same rhythm Alexander had seen in the nursery. A primal, ancient rhythm. "You are safe," Sarah whispered, burying her face in the baby's neck. "You are loved. You are strong." The room held its breath. Alexander stood at the foot of the bed, his hands gripping the plastic footboard, praying to a God he hadn't spoken to in years. Beep, beep, beep. The frantic rhythm on the monitor slowed, the jagged lines smoothed out. Ava let out a long, shuddering sigh. Her tiny hand, which had been clenched in a fist, slowly opened and rested against Sarah's collarbone. Her breathing deepened. The flush of fever began to recede, replaced by the natural color of sleep. "Incredible," Dr. Roberts breathed, checking the vitals. "Her cortisol levels are dropping instantly. She's stabilizing." Sarah didn't look at the doctor. She just kept rocking, tears streaming silently down her face, landing on the hospital blanket. She was the anchor, and Ava had finally found the harbor. Alexander watched them, and he felt his own heart break and reform in the same second. He realized that all his money, all his power, all his skyscrapers meant absolutely nothing compared to the magic he was witnessing. This woman, whom he had discarded like trash, possessed the only power that mattered. 3 hours later, Ava was sleeping peacefully, her vitals perfect. Sarah sat in the chair next to the bed, holding her hand. The door to the private room flew open. "Alex, there you are!" Tiffany St. Clair stood in the doorway, wearing a white tennis outfit and holding a designer smoothie. She looked annoyed. "I've been calling you all morning. The spa reception said you left in a panic. Is the baby dead?" The temperature in the room dropped to absolute zero. Sarah stiffened, her hand tightening over Ava's. Alexander stood up from the corner where he had been watching Sarah. He turned slowly to face Tiffany. His face was devoid of expression, which made him terrifying. "Get out," Alexander said. Tiffany blinked. "Excuse me. I came all the way here to support you in this unfortunate time. Though I told you, Alex, weak babies are just nature's way of—" Alexander crossed the room in 2 strides. He towered over her. "I said, get out." "Don't speak to me like that," Tiffany snapped, her voice rising. "I am your fiancé. I demand—" Alexander pulled his phone from his pocket. He didn't say a word. He simply pressed play on the video file and held the screen in front of Tiffany's face. The video played, Tiffany checking the hall, Tiffany planting the bracelet, Tiffany leaning over the crib, Tiffany pinching Noah, the baby screaming, Tiffany smiling. Tiffany's face went gray. The smoothie cup shook in her hand. That That's doctored, she stammered, backing away. That's a deep fake. You can't believe that. I watched it with my own eyes, Alexander said, his voice low and dangerous. I saw you hurt my son. I saw you frame an innocent woman. You are a monster, Tiffany. And if you are not off my property, out of my life, and out of this city by sunrise, I will release this video to every news outlet, every social media platform, and every one of your high society friends. Tiffany gasped. You wouldn't. It would ruin me. You ruined yourself, Alexander said. The engagement is over. The wedding is canceled. Security is packing your bags as we speak. They will leave them on the curb. But the prenup, Tiffany tried, desperation creeping in. We aren't married. Alexander stepped closer, his blue eyes burning with cold fire. You get nothing. Now leave before I forget that I'm a gentleman and call the police for child abuse. Tiffany looked at Alexander, then at Sarah, who was watching her with a gaze of pure pity. That pity hurt Tiffany more than the anger. She let out a strangled cry of rage, spun on her heel, and fled down the hospital corridor, the sound of her expensive sneakers squeaking on the linoleum. Alexander closed the door. He took a deep breath, feeling the toxic air leave the room. He turned back to Sarah. She's gone, he said, for good. Sarah looked down at Ava. She was a very unhappy woman, Mr. Thorne. Only unhappy people try to destroy happiness. Alexander. He corrected her gently. Please, call me Alexander. He walked over to the chair and knelt beside her again, placing his hand over hers on the bed rail. Sarah, I cannot ask you to work for me again, he said. Sarah looked up, alarm in her eyes. You're firing me again? No, Alexander shook his head. I'm saying I can't ask you to be just a maid. I need a partner. I need help raising them. I need someone who knows how to love them because I am still learning. I want you to come back as the head of the household. You will have full authority. No uniforms, no servants' quarters. You live in the main house. You help me raise them. And if you can find it in your heart to forgive me, I would like to try and be the man you told Ava I was. Sarah looked at him. She saw the arrogance stripped away. She saw a father who was terrified and humbled. She smiled, and it was like the sun breaking through the Seattle rain. We have a lot of work to do, Alexander, she said softly. Noah needs new shoes, and Liam is starting to teeth. We can do that, Alexander smiled. A genuine, warm smile that reached his eyes for the first time in years. We can do all of that. Epilogue. 1 year later, the garden of the Thorne estate was no longer a manicured display of geometric hedges that no one was allowed to touch. It was a chaotic, vibrant playground. Toys were scattered on the grass. A swing set had been installed under the great oak tree. It was a sunny Saturday afternoon. Alexander sat on a picnic blanket wearing jeans with grass stains on the knees. He was laughing as Liam and Noah, now toddlers with wobbly legs and boundless energy, tackled him. Got you, Daddy, Noah squealed. Oh no, I'm trapped, Alexander laughed, rolling over and tickling them until they shrieked with joy. A few feet away, Sarah sat on a garden bench watching them. She wasn't wearing a uniform. She wore a beautiful, flowing yellow sundress that complemented her radiant skin. Ava was sitting in her lap, braiding a dandelion into Sarah's hair. Mama Sarah, look! Ava pointed. Daddy is a monster! A very ticklish monster, Sarah laughed. Alexander extricated himself from the pile of boys and walked over to the bench. He looked different. The hard lines of his face had softened. The perpetual frown was gone. He looked younger, lighter. He sat down next to Sarah, wiping the hair from his forehead. They have too much energy, he panted, smiling. I blame the cooking. You're feeding them too well. They are growing, Sarah said, smoothing his collar. They are happy. Alexander looked at her. The year had been a journey of healing. They had rebuilt the trust slowly. He had learned to change diapers, to soothe nightmares, to be present. And through it all, Sarah had been his guide, his rock, and eventually, his best friend. But lately, friend felt like a word that was too small. He reached into his pocket. He didn't have a ring the size of a skating rink. He didn't have a press release. He had a simple, elegant gold band with a single clear sapphire, blue like the ocean, deep and calm. "Sarah," Alexander said, his voice dropping to that serious, tender tone he used only for her. She stopped braiding the flower and looked at him. The air in the garden seemed to stand still. "You saved my daughter's life," Alexander began. "You saved my son's. But I think you know that you saved me too. This house was a tomb before you brought the light back in." "Alexander," Sarah's breath hitched. "I don't want you to just be the head of the household anymore," Alexander said, taking her hand. "I don't want you to just be Mama Sarah. I love you. I love the way you sing in the morning. I love the way you challenge me. I love you." He got down on one knee in the grass, oblivious to the grass stains, oblivious to the world. "Sarah Jenkins, will you marry me? Will you be the mother of these children officially? Will you make me the happiest man on earth?" Sarah looked at the man who had once been a stranger in a cold car, now kneeling before her with his heart in his hands. She looked at the triplets, who had stopped playing and were watching with wide, curious eyes. She didn't need to think. She had loved him since the moment she saw him try to hold Noah in the rain and realized he was just a frightened father needing help. "Yes," Sarah whispered, tears filling her eyes. "Yes, Alexander, I will." He slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. He stood up and kissed her. A kiss that wasn't for the cameras, or for society, or for show. It was a kiss of promise, of redemption, and of a love that had survived the storm. "Ew!" Noah yelled from the grass, covering his eyes. Alexander and Sarah broke apart, laughing. Alexander scooped Ava up in one arm and pulled Sarah close with the other. "Come here, you rascals!" Alexander shouted to the boys. As the children ran toward them, crashing into their legs in a hug that encompassed the whole family, the camera panned out. The cold, imposing mansion in the background didn't look like a fortress anymore. With the windows open, the curtains blowing in the breeze, and the sound of laughter rising from the garden, it finally looked like a home. The end